Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. The silver tray felt like a leaden weight against Asha's calloused palms, its polished surface reflecting the flickering torchlight of the great hall. Every step she took was a calculated gamble in invisibility, a silent dance between the towering pillars of ancient cedar and the crushing indifference of the wolf elite. Around her, the air grew thick with the scent of roasted meat, expensive wine, and the underlying pheromones of powerful predators. These were the high-born Lycans of the Black Ridge Pack, a lineage of warriors who measured worth in muscle and blood. Asha shifted her grip on the tray, her knuckles turning white as she moved past a group of laughing guards. She was a ghost in their house, a shadow that served their wine and cleaned their spills. Building on the resentment of years spent in the dirt, she kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards. To look up was to invite trouble, yet her eyes betray her by drifting toward the dais. There sat Kael, the future Alpha, his shoulders broad enough to carry the sky and eyes like molten gold that burned through everything they touched. Beside him sat Alara, the newly crowned Luna, draped in silk that shimmered like a snake's skin. Alara had once been the girl Asha shared secrets with in the meadows, back before the Great Rejection stripped Asha of her status and her pride. Now, Alara was the sun, and Asha was merely the dust motes dancing in her light. Why did the heart insist on beating for a man who had looked at her 5 years ago and seen nothing but a defect? Because the bond between wolves was supposed to be sacred, she felt the phantom itch of a mark that never bloomed on her skin. She reached the edge of the royal table, her movements fluid and mechanical. Kael was speaking, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest like distant thunder. He didn't look at her as she refilled his goblet, but his hand brushed hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that made her breath hitch in her throat. He didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the spark, continuing his conversation about border patrols as if a common servant hadn't just felt her soul ignite. Following the rhythm of the court, she stepped back into the shadows, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The ceremony was reaching its peak, a celebration of the pack's strength and the union of its leaders. The highborns raised their glasses, their voices rising in a unified howl that shook the very foundations of the hall. It was a sound of belonging, of pack, of home. Things Asha had forgotten the taste of. She swallowed hard, the bitterness of her position coating her tongue like ash. How many more years could she endure this slow erosion of her spirit? The hall suddenly plunged into a heavy, expectant silence as the massive oak doors groaned open. A figure cloaked in tattered gray wool shuffled inside, the tip of a white staff clicking rhythmically against the stone. It was the blind elder, a man whose age was whispered to be older than the trees themselves. He didn't need eyes to see the hierarchy of the room. He navigated the maze of tables with a predatory grace that put the young warriors to shame. The air chilled as he passed, the scent of ozone and ancient earth following in his wake. Moving with a purpose that ignored the king and queen, the elder walked straight past the dais. The royals stood, their faces masked in confusion and a hint of suppressed fear. No one spoke. Even the hounds under the tables ceased their growling. The elder's path took him toward the servants' alcove, where the lowest of the low huddled like frightened rabbits. Asha felt a cold sweat break out across her brow. She tried to shrink further into the dark, but the clicking of the staff grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped directly in front of her. The elder tilted his head, his sightless eyes milky orbs that seemed to pierce through her skin and bone. He reached out a gnarled hand, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered near her face. "The moon does not forget its own," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. Before Asha could react, before she could even draw a breath to scream, the most powerful mystic in the Northern Territories did the unthinkable. He folded his tall, spindly frame and dropped to his knees at her feet. Shock rippled through the hall like a physical blow, followed by a deafening collective gasp. Kael was on his feet in an instant, his chair clattering to the ground behind him. His eyes were wide, fixed on the scene of a holy man prostrating himself before a girl who wasn't even allowed to own a pair of boots. Asha stared down at the elder's bowed head, her heart stopping in her chest. The world had just tilted on its axis, and for the first time in her life, the invisibility she had craved was gone, replaced by a spotlight that felt like an executioner's blade. Chapter 2. The Kneeling Court. Transitional phrases usually bridge the gap between fear and reality, but for Asha, the transition was a violent plunge into chaos. The blind elder remained motionless on the cold floor, his forehead pressed against the toe of her worn leather slippers. Behind her, the other servants scrambled away as if she had suddenly caught fire. The silence in the great hall was no longer respectful. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room until her lungs burned. Every eye in the pack was a spear directed at her heart, sharp and demanding an explanation she didn't possess. Because the elder had knelt, the social fabric of the Black Ridge pack began to unravel in real time. A low, confused murmur started at the back of the room and surged forward like a tidal wave. Kael's father, the reigning king, stepped down from the dais with a snarl dancing on his lips. His presence was a mountain of aggression, his scent of musk and cedar suffocating the air around Asha. "Elder, what is the meaning of this mockery?" the king demanded, his hand hovering over the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. The old man didn't move, his voice rising in a haunting chant that seemed to vibrate the very wine in the glasses. Following the lead of their spiritual guide, one by one, the high-ranking council members began to shift. It started with the eldest general, a man whose scars told the story of 100 wars. He looked at the elder, then at the trembling girl in the servant's tunic, and slowly, with a grimace of disbelief, he lowered his body. Then another followed, and another. The sound of knees hitting stone echoed through the rafters like a series of gunshots. It was a domino effect of ancient tradition overriding modern prejudice. Kael stood frozen atop the dais, his hands gripped so tightly on the carved wood that the timber began to splinter. He looked down at Asha, and for the first time since the night he rejected her, he truly saw her. He didn't see the servant. He saw the girl with the eyes of a storm, the one whose scent had haunted the periphery of his dreams for half a decade. His wolf was pacing inside him, a frantic, snarling beast that recognized a truth his mind was too proud to accept. Why was the entire court bowing to a female who supposedly had no wolf of her own? The elder finally spoke, his voice ringing out with a clarity that defied his frail appearance. "The crown is not made of gold, but of the blood that refuses to die," he proclaimed to the rafters. He reached out and grasped Asha's hand, his grip surprisingly strong, pulling her forward. She stumbled, her legs feeling like water. She wanted to run, to hide in the woods until this nightmare ended. But the weight of the moment held her pinned. The king was the only one left standing besides Kael and Alara, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as his authority withered. Because of the mounting tension, the air in the hall turned thick with the static of an impending shift. Wolves were creatures of hierarchy, and the elder had just placed a servant above the king. Alara's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, her fingers digging into the silk of her dress until it tore. She looked at Kael, seeking support, but he was lost in a trance, his golden eyes locked on Asha's pale face. He stepped down the stairs, his movement slow and predatory, heading straight for the girl who had spent 5 years avoiding his shadow. Asha backed away, but the circle of kneeling warriors blocked her path. She was trapped in a ring of submission that felt more like a cage. Kael stopped inches from her, his heat radiating off him in waves that made her dizzy. He looked down at the elder, then back at her, his jaw set in a hard line. Without a word, he slowly sank to one knee, his head bowing in a gesture of absolute recognition. The impact of his surrender hit Asha harder than a physical blow. The man who had broken her heart was now at her feet, and the terror of what this meant for her survival outweighed any sense of triumph. Chapter 3. Chains of Recognition. As the echoes of the kneeling court faded into a tense, vibrating hum, the transition from reverence to rage happened in a heartbeat. The king's roar shattered the spell, his transformation starting before he even reached the center of the hall. Fur sprouted along his jaw, and his bones cracked with the sickening sound of shifting anatomy. "Manipulation!" he bellowed, his voice half human, half beast. "She has used some foul witchcraft to cloud the elder's mind. Guards, seize the pretender." The heavy atmosphere of worship evaporated, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of drawn steel. Because the king's word was law, the spell of the kneeling warriors was broken by the instinct to obey their alpha. Men who had been on their knees seconds ago scrambled to their feet, their faces flushed with shame and confusion. They surged forward, a wall of muscle and leather aiming to crush the small woman at the center of the storm. Asha felt the first true spark of panic ignite in her gut. She had spent her life being small and quiet to avoid this very moment. Now the entire pack was coming for her, and she had no fangs to defend herself. Following the chaotic surge of the guards, Kael moved with a speed that blurred the vision of every human eye in the room. He didn't join the attack. He pivoted, placing his massive body between Asha and the oncoming soldiers. His own shift was partial, his eyes glowing a feral orange and his fingernails lengthening into obsidian talons. He let out a snarl that wasn't a command, but a promise of death to anyone who took another step. "Touch her and you lose the hand," he rumbled, his voice dripping with a newfound, terrifying possessiveness. The hall became a standoff of high-stakes tension, with the crown prince defying the king over a servant girl. Alara screamed from the dais, her voice high and piercing, accusing Asha of seducing the prince with dark magic. Subplots whispered in the corners of the room, as rival families watched the royal line fracture in a single night. If Kael stood against his father, the pack would bleed. If he gave her up, he would be betraying the very mystic who guided their souls. The guards hesitated, looking between their current alpha and the man who would one day lead them. Amidst the shouting and the clatter of weapons, a heavy hand fell on Asha's shoulder, dragging her backward. It wasn't Kael, but a high-ranking inquisitor with eyes like cold flint. Before she could scream, a heavy iron shackle was snapped around her wrist, the cold metal burning like ice against her skin. "For the safety of the pack, she will be held for interrogation," the king commanded, his voice trembling with fury. Kael lunged forward, but the elder stepped between him and the guards, shaking his head with a solemn, knowing look. Because of the elder's silent intervention, Kael forced himself to stand down, his muscles quivering with the effort of restraint. He watched as they dragged Asha toward the darkened corridor that led to the dungeons beneath the hall. She looked back at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and an ancient waking hunger. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a queen being led to a cage she was already outgrowing. The connection between them pulled tight, a golden thread that burned brighter the further they were separated. The heavy iron door of the interrogation cell slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Asha's very marrow. She was alone in the dark, the scent of damp stone and old blood filling her nose. She sank to the floor, the shackles rattling against the floorboards. In the distance, she could hear the muffled sounds of the court in an uproar, but closer, right outside her door, she heard the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a wolf. Kael was there, leaning against the wood, his presence the only thing standing between her and the darkness. He had rejected her once, but tonight, the moon had forced him to see the truth, and neither of them would ever be the same again. Chapter 4. The Predator's Shadow. The transition from the grand, suffocating heat of the hall to the damp, skeletal chill of the dungeons was a descent into a different kind of silence. Here, the air tasted of salt and ancient rot, a stark contrast to the spiced wines that still stained the floorboards above. Asha sat on a stone bench, her wrists raw where the heavy iron bit into her skin with every shallow breath. Because the cell was carved directly into the living rock of the mountain, every drop of water hitting the floor echoed like a heartbeat in the dark. She was no longer a ghost serving at the table. She was a carcass waiting for the vultures to decide who got the first bite. Moving with a silence that defied his massive frame, Kael appeared on the other side of the rusted bars, his silhouette cutting a jagged hole in the torchlight. He didn't speak, but his scent, something like rain-drenched pine and the metallic tang of lightning, flooded the small space. It was a sensory assault that made her dead wolf twitch beneath her ribs, a sensation she hadn't felt since the night he had looked at her and laughed at the idea of a bond. Why was he here now, staring at her with eyes that looked less like a judge and more like a starving man watching a feast? Following the instinct to protect the little dignity she had left, Asha stood, the chains clattering a frantic rhythm against the stone. "Have you come to finish the job, Prince?" She spat, her voice raspy from the dust of the cells. "Or did the king send you to see if I've grown claws in the dark?" Kael's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the iron bars until the metal groaned under his strength. He looked at her, and for a moment, the arrogant alpha mask slipped, revealing a raw, jagged edge of confusion that made her heart stutter. Because the accusation of witchcraft hung over her like a noose, the weight of their shared history felt heavier than the mountain pressing down on them. Kael stepped closer, his face pressed against the bars, his breath ghosting over her skin. "The Elder says you are the key to a door I didn't even know was locked," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly at her soul. "My wolf hasn't stopped howling since he knelt to you, Asha. It's a sound of mourning, and I don't know what we are grieving." Asha let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed off the damp walls. "You're grieving the lie you told yourself 5 years ago," she said, her eyes flashing with a sudden defiant heat. "You're grieving the fact that the girl you threw away as worthless might be the only thing that can save your crumbling throne." She stepped into the sliver of light, letting him see the bruises the guards had left on her arms. High-stakes politics meant nothing to her. She was fighting for the right to exist in a world that had tried to erase her. Transitional phrases usually bridge the gap between enemies, but the tension between them was a bridge made of fire. Kael reached through the bars, his fingers grazing her cheek with a tenderness that terrified her more than his father's threats. The contact sent a jolt of primal energy through her, a golden spark that flickered behind her eyelids. For a split second, she didn't see the cell. She saw a field of white fur and red blood, a vision of a crown being crushed under a heavy paw. She yanked herself back, her chest heaving as the vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The interrogation was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was a battle of wills between two people who were bound by a fate they both hated. Kael pulled his hand back, his expression hardening into a mask of grim determination. "The council wants your head on a spike by dawn," he said, his voice regaining its royal authority. "But my wolf has decided that you belong to me for the investigation. You don't leave my sight, Asha. Not because I trust you, but because I can't trust myself when you're gone." Chapter 5. The Stirring Beast. As the heavy iron door groaned open to release her into Kael's personal custody, the transition from prisoner to investigative property felt like trading a cage for a leash. Kael didn't lead her back to the servant quarters. He marched her toward the high towers where the royal apartments sat like eagle nests above the forest. Because he refused to let anyone else touch her, he kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, a claim that made every guard they passed drop their gaze in a mixture of respect and simmering resentment. The pack was watching, and the whispers were already spreading like wildfire through the dry brush of the mountain. Moving through the opulent hallways of the upper sanctum, Asha felt like an invasive species in a curated garden. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting the Great Hunt, and the floors were covered in furs from beasts she couldn't name. Kael shoved the door to his private study open, the room smelling of old parchment and the heavy, masculine scent of his skin. He didn't offer her a seat. He moved to the window, staring out at the moon that hung over the peaks like a judging eye. "Tell me about your wolf," he demanded, his back still turned to her. Following the memory of her greatest shame, Asha wrapped her arms around her middle as if she could physically hold herself together. "There is nothing to tell," she said, her voice small against the vastness of the room. "She died the night you rejected me. She was a pup who thought she found her home, and you starved her until she stopped breathing." The honesty of her words hung in the air, a physical weight that made Kael flinch as if she had struck him. He turned, his eyes glowing with a fierce, predatory light, that made her breath hitch. Because the bond was a living thing, her words acted like a catalyst for the monster lurking beneath his skin. Kael crossed the room in 3 long, aggressive strides, pinning her against the heavy oak door before she could even think of retreating. His heat was a physical wall, a suffocating, intoxicating presence that made her knees feel like wax. "She isn't dead," he growled, his face inches from hers, his pupils blown wide until the gold of his eyes was almost swallowed by black. "I can hear her. She's scratching at the inside of your ribs, screaming for the mate you told her she couldn't have." Asha's breath came in ragged, uneven gasps as the room began to spin. She wanted to push him away, to scream that he had no right to talk about her wolf after what he'd done, but the words died in her throat. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her chest, and to her horror, she felt a familiar, long-forgotten heat blooming at the base of her spine. It was a slow, agonizing throb, a pulse of power that felt like a heartbeat answering his call. Her dead wolf wasn't dead. She had been waiting in the dark, and Kael's touch was the only key to her cage. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between hatred and desire, and in that moment, the line was completely obliterated. Kael's hand moved to her throat, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive intensity that made her whimper. It wasn't a sound of fear, but of recognition, a primal surrender to a force that was older than their names. He dipped his head, his nose brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck, inhaling her scent, as if it were the only air in the world. "You smell like the forest after a fire," he murmured against her skin. Dangerous and new. The high-stakes conflict of the court felt miles away as they stood locked in their own private war. Asha reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, her nails scratching against his scalp. She hated him for what he'd done, but her body was a traitor, singing a song of belonging that she couldn't silence. Just as his lips brushed against hers, a sharp, urgent knocking at the door shattered the moment. Kael pulled back, his chest heaving, his eyes clearing just enough to realize how close he had come to losing control. Chapter 6. The King's Gambit. The transition from the intimacy of the study to the cold reality of a royal summons was a bucket of ice water to Asha's sensitized nerves. Kael smoothed his tunic, the alpha mask sliding back into place with a chilling efficiency that made her wonder if the man who had just touched her was a ghost. Because the king's messenger refused to leave, Kael was forced to open the door, revealing a soldier who looked like he had seen a vision of the end of the world. "The council is in an uproar, my prince," the man stuttered. "A rival Alpha has arrived at the gates, claiming he has proof of the girl's lineage." Moving with a grim sense of inevitability, Kael grabbed a cloak and threw it over Asha's shoulders, hiding her servant's tunic and the shackles that still hung from one of her wrists. He didn't look at her, but his grip on her arm was tight enough to leave a mark. They marched back down to the throne room, but this time the atmosphere was different. The air was charged with a heavy electric tension, the kind that precedes a storm that levels cities. At the center of the room stood a man Asha didn't recognize, his armor black as midnight and his eyes like chips of flint. Following the stranger's gaze, Asha felt a cold shiver of dread crawl up her spine. This man didn't look at her with the disgust of the Black Ridge Pack. He looked at her with a terrifying, reverent hunger. He stepped forward, his voice a smooth, cultured purr that carried to every corner of the hall. "I have come for what was stolen from my people," he announced, his eyes never leaving Asha's face. The royal bloodline of the Silver Crest was thought to be extinct, yet here stands a daughter of the first Alphas, serving wine to dogs. Because of the stranger's words, the throne room erupted into a cacophony of denials and shouts of outrage. The king stood, his face white with a mixture of fear and fury. "She is a defect, a nameless runt, born to a traitor," he roared, his voice cracking with the strain of his lie. The rival Alpha laughed, a sound like glass breaking, and pulled a tattered, blood-stained scroll from his belt. "The stars do not lie, Black Ridge." The elder knelt because he saw the moon's own blood. She is not a servant. She is your superior." Asha felt the world shrinking until there was nothing but the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. A daughter of the Silver Crest? The name was a legend, a ghost story told to pups about a line of wolves so powerful they could command the elements themselves. She looked at Kael, seeking some kind of anchor, but he was staring at the rival Alpha with a look of pure, murderous intent. He wasn't thinking about her lineage. He was thinking about the fact that another man was claiming her. The possessiveness she had felt in the study was now a physical roar that shook the air. Transitional phrases usually bridge the gap between truth and survival, but for Asha, the truth was a death sentence. If she was a Silver Crest, she was a threat to every Alpha in the Northern Territories. She was no longer a girl. She was a piece on a chessboard she didn't understand. Kael stepped in front of her, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "She stays with the Black Ridge," he declared, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that silenced the room. "She is under my investigation, and no foreign cur will take her from this house." The rivalry between the two packs was a high-stakes powder keg, and the fuse had just been lit. The stranger smiled, showing a row of teeth that were far too sharp for a human form. "Then keep her for now, Prince," he said, bowing with a mocking flourish. "But remember, a cage cannot hold a goddess forever. When she fully awakens, she will burn this mountain to ash, and I will be there to collect the embers." He turned and walked out, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like it would crush the lungs of everyone left in the room. Kael turned to Asha, his eyes burning with a mix of protectiveness and a new, terrifying doubt. The hunt had begun, and she was the only prize that mattered. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. The transition from the chaos of the throne room to the suffocating silence of Kael's private wing felt like moving from a battlefield into a tomb. Every step Asha took on the plush carpets felt heavy, her mind reeling from the rival Alpha's declaration of her royal Silvercrest lineage. Because she was now considered a volatile political asset, Kael had moved her into a suite adjacent to his own, a room filled with silks and perfumes that smelled of a life she didn't know how to live. She stood by the hearth, watching the flames lick the logs, feeling the iron shackle on her wrist grow warm from the heat. It was a constant reminder that no matter how many people knelt, she was still a prisoner of her own blood. Moving with the restless energy of a caged predator, Kael paced the length of the room, his eyes never straying far from her. He had dismissed the guards, opting to be her sole keeper, a decision that whispered of a possessiveness that went far deeper than pack law. "You knew," he suddenly accused, his voice a low vibration that made the crystal decanters on the side table hum. "You knew you weren't just a stray found on the borders." Asha turned, her eyes snapping with a fire that rivaled the hearth. "I knew I was a girl who was told she was nothing for 5 years," she countered, her voice trembling with the weight of her suppressed rage. "I knew I was the person you looked at and saw a defect." Following the sharp edge of her words, Kael stopped his pacing, the space between them crackling with the static of unresolved tension. Why did the truth of her birth change the way he moved toward her, making his wolf press against the surface of his skin with such violent hunger? He reached out, his fingers tracing the cold iron of her shackle, his touch a confusing mixture of reverence and control. The Silvercrest line was said to be extinct because they were too powerful to be allowed to live, he murmured, his thumb brushing the sensitive skin of her inner wrist. "If the king confirms this, you aren't just a servant anymore, Asha. You are a claim that could start a war." Because the stakes had shifted from her survival to the survival of the entire North, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of 1,000 eyes. Kael leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching in his throat. For a second, the prince was gone, leaving only a male who recognized his mate in the dark. He didn't claim her lips, but he lingered in the space where their breaths mingled, a silent admission of a bond that was screaming to be acknowledged. She wanted to push him away, to scream at the unfairness of a fate that only made her valuable when she carried a crown, but her body betrayed her, leaning into his heat as if she were a flower reaching for the sun. Chapter 8. Whispers of the Blood. As the moon reached its zenith and bathed the suite in a ghostly silver glow, the transition into the deeper mysteries of Asha's past began to take hold. She found herself unable to sleep, the bed's down mattress feeling too soft and alien compared to the straw mats of her previous life. Because her dead wolf was now wide awake and pacing within her soul, she felt every shift in the wind and every heartbeat of the guards in the hallway. She sat at the vanity, staring at her reflection, searching for the face of a royal she didn't remember being. The air in the room suddenly grew cold, smelling of ancient frost and the sharp, metallic tang of a mountain storm. Moving like a shadow within shadows, the blind elder appeared in the corner of the room, his presence so silent she wouldn't have known he was there if not for the sudden change in the atmosphere. "The blood remembers what the mind chooses to forget," he whispered, his sightless eyes fixed on her as if he could see the very atoms of her spirit. Asha didn't scream. She felt a strange, chilling sense of calm settle over her. "What am I, Elder?" she asked, her voice a mere thread of sound in the dark. "Am I a girl or am I a weapon?" Following the rhythm of his tapping staff, the old man moved toward her, his hand reaching out to touch the silver locket she had hidden beneath her tunic for years. "You are the dawn that follows the longest night," he proclaimed, his voice echoing with the weight of a prophecy. "But a dawn is also a fire that burns away the old world. The rival Alpha seeks your power, the king seeks your silence, and the prince seeks his soul." He leaned in closer, his scent of earth and ozone filling her senses. "You must find the strength to choose yourself before they choose for you, little spark." Because of the elder's cryptic warning, Asha felt a surge of a new, terrifying power coiling in her gut like a sleeping dragon. It wasn't just a wolf. It was something older, something that made the very stones of the castle vibrate in sympathy with her pulse. She looked down at her hands and saw faint glowing lines of silver tracing her veins, a map of a heritage that had been buried under layers of shame. The subplot of her life was finally becoming the main narrative, and the realization was a high-stakes epiphany that made her heart race. She wasn't a defect. She was the original design. Chapter 9. The Price of a Life. The transition from the elder's haunting visit to the brutal reality of the morning was marked by the sound of steel clashing in the courtyard below. Asha stood at the window, watching Kael train with his elite guard, his movements a blur of lethal grace and raw power. He fought with a desperation she hadn't seen before, as if he were trying to outrun the very thoughts that plagued him. Because he had claimed her for investigation, he was now the target of the council's ire, his loyalty questioned by those who feared the return of the silver crest. He looked up and caught her eye, his expression a mask of grim determination that sent a shiver of dread down her spine. Moving through the corridors with a newfound silent authority, Asha made her way toward the library, ignoring the whispers of the servants who now scurried out of her path. She needed to know the truth about the massacre of the Silver Crest, the event that had left her an orphan in the dirt. Following a trail of dusty scrolls and forgotten ledgers, she found a hidden chamber that smelled of parchment and secrets. There, she discovered the high-stakes betrayal that had ended her line, a pact made between the packs to eliminate the royal blood before it could unite them. The king of the Black Ridge hadn't just found her. He had stolen her to ensure the line remained broken. Because the truth was a jagged blade that cut through her last remaining ties to the pack, Asha felt her resolve harden into a cold, diamond-sharp purpose. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a witness to a crime that spanned generations. As she turned to leave, the door was blocked by Alara, the Luna's face twisted in a sneer of desperate malice. "You think a drop of royal blood makes you his equal?" Alara hissed, a silver dagger glinting in her hand. "He will never choose a ghost over a living queen. I will make sure of it." The confrontation in the library was a high-stakes clash of old jealousy and new power. Alara lunged, her movements fueled by a frantic, jagged rage, but Asha didn't flinch. She felt the silver fire in her veins leap to her defense, a wave of pure, kinetic energy that threw the Luna back against the shelves with the force of a physical blow. Books rained down like autumn leaves as Alara slumped to the floor, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't name. Asha stood over her, the glow in her eyes lighting the shadows of the room. She didn't need a dagger. She was the weapon. Chapter 10. The Fractured Truth. The transition from the library's cold violence to the high-stakes confrontation with Kael felt like walking through a house fire without burning. Asha stood in the center of the royal corridor, her skin still humming with the silver electricity she had used to drop the Luna. Because her lineage was no longer a theory, but a physical roar in her blood, the very air around her seemed to warp and shimmer. She met Kael halfway to the council chambers, his face a storm of conflicting loyalties and raw, primal hunger. He didn't look at the unconscious Alara being carried away by healers. His golden eyes were fixed on the silver light fading from Asha's fingertips. Moving with a desperation that shattered his prince-like composure, Kael grabbed her shoulders, his touch searing through the thin silk of her borrowed gown. "The council has voted," he rasped, his voice thick with a terror he had never shown on a battlefield. "They want to verify your blood through a trial of the moon, a ritual that hasn't been performed since the Silver Crest fell." Following the logic of the Pack's ancient laws, she knew this wasn't an interrogation. It was a death trap designed to see if her wolf could survive a concentrated dose of lunar radiation. Why did he care if she survived a test he had once claimed she was too weak to even take? Because the bond was finally screaming through the cracks in his pride, Kael pulled her into an alcove, his body shielding her from the prying eyes of the court. "I will not let you walk into that circle alone," he whispered, his forehead dropping against hers as his wolf let out a low, mournful rumble. "I rejected the bond once because I was a coward who feared a mate with no power. But I will not lose you now that the world finally sees what you are." Asha felt a bitter, jagged laugh tear from her throat, her hands coming up to push against his chest. She didn't want his protection now that she was something. She wanted the man who should have chosen her when she was nothing. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between old wounds and new power, and Asha felt the bridge burning behind her. She looked up at him, her eyes glowing with a cold, ethereal light that made him flinch. "You don't get to earn my trust by protecting a crown, Kael," she said, her voice a steady, rhythmic pulse of silver fire. "You have to earn the girl you left in the dirt, and she is far harder to please than a queen." The high-stakes drama of their connection was no longer about a hidden mark. It was about the survival of her soul. She stepped out of his shadow, heading toward the ritual grounds, leaving him standing in the dark with the ghost of a choice he had made 5 years too late. Chapter 11. The Trial of the Moon. As the transition into the sacred grove began, the atmosphere shifted from political tension to ancient, supernatural dread. The grove was a circle of white stone, open to the night sky and surrounded by the entire Black Ridge Pack, their eyes gleaming like 1,000 predatory stars. Because the Silver Crest blood was the only thing that could survive the unfiltered light of the blood moon, the ritual was a binary verdict. She was either a goddess or a corpse. Asha stepped into the center of the circle, her bare feet hitting the cold marble with a sound that echoed like a heartbeat. The king stood on the high balcony, his face a mask of cold, calculating indifference. Moving like a shadow detached from its body, the blind elder approached the perimeter of the circle, his white staff tracing a line of silver dust in the air. "The moon demands the truth, and the truth is written in fire," he proclaimed, his voice rising above the restless murmurs of the crowd. Following the ancient protocol, the clouds parted, and a beam of concentrated crimson moonlight hit the center of the altar. Asha felt her breath hitch as the radiation soaked into her pores, a sensation of 1,000 needles of ice being driven into her marrow. She didn't scream. She stood still, her wolf finally breaking through the last of her mental barriers to meet the light. Because her wolf was a royal entity, the transformation was not a messy shift of bone and fur, but a shimmering, cinematic eruption of silver energy. The crowd gasped as a massive, ethereal wolf made of pure light manifested behind her, its eyes a blinding white that matched her own. The subplot of her defect was shattered forever. She wasn't a wolfless runt. She was a carrier of the original spirit. The high-stakes pressure of the ritual caused the white stones beneath her feet to crack, the power of her lineage vibrating through the mountain until the very foundations of the castle groaned. Kael watched from the front row, his own wolf howling in a mixture of agony and absolute bone-deep worship. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between the girl and the myth, and in that moment, the myth took over. Asha turned her gaze toward the king, the power of the silver crest making her voice sound like a chorus of ancestors. "You stole the sun and expected the world to stay dark," she said, the words echoing with the force of a physical blow. "But the moon remembers its own, and the debt you owe my blood is finally due." The high-stakes conflict had reached its boiling point, and as the crimson light faded, the pack didn't see a servant. They saw the only person in 5 centuries who could truly claim the throne. Chapter 12. The Shattered Choice. The transition from the spiritual heights of the trial to the brutal reality of the aftermath was a descent into a new kind of war. As Asha stepped out of the circle, the pack fell to their knees in a wave of instinctive primal submission, a sound like a forest bowing to a storm. Because she had survived, the king's authority was officially in question, but the old wolf wasn't ready to surrender his crown to a girl he had spent years belittling. He signaled to his elite guards, their silver-tipped spears dropping into a defensive formation. "She is a manifestation of the rival Alpha's curse," the king roared, his desperation turning into a dangerous, jagged madness. Moving with the speed of a thunderclap, Kael stepped into the gap between Asha and the king's soldiers, his own shift complete this time. He was a massive, golden-furred beast, his growl a sound that shook the very leaves from the trees. Following the lead of their prince, several younger warriors shifted as well, turning their backs on the king to protect the woman they had just seen walk through fire. The high-stakes divide of the pack was now a physical line in the dirt, brother against brother and father against son. Kael turned his head to look at Asha, his eyes pleading for a trust he knew he hadn't yet earned. Because the rival Alpha's truth was still hanging over them like a guillotine, the arrival of a messenger interrupted the impending slaughter. "The Silver Crest borders have been breached," the man shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "The rival Alpha is not here for a queen. He is here for a sacrifice." The subplot of the stranger's intent was finally revealed. He didn't want to restore her line. He wanted to consume her power to fuel his own ascension. The high-stakes tension of the moment shifted from internal civil war to external survival as the first sounds of battle echoed from the valley below. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between enemies, and Asha realized that her choice was no longer about her heart, but about the lives of everyone in the mountains. She looked at Kael, then at the king, then at the horizon, where the black-armored wolves were appearing like a tide of shadow. "I am not a prize to be won," she said, her voice cutting through the snarls and the shouting. "I am the wall that stands between you and the end." She reached out and grabbed Kael's massive paw, her silver light flowing into him, creating a bond that was no longer a fate, but a weapon. The war had arrived, and the rejected Omega was the only one who could lead them through the night. Chapter 13. The Echo of the Vow. The transition from the scorched stones of the ritual grove to the cold, tactical atmosphere of the war room felt like a physical blow to Asha's newly awakened senses. Her skin still hummed with the residual silver of the blood moon, a vibration that made the air around her feel heavy and electric. Because she was now the undisputed center of the pack's survival, the council members who once spat at her feet now bowed their heads as she passed. She stood before the massive map of the Northern Territories, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of the Black Ridge borders. The scent of maps, ink, and the sweat of terrified men filled the room, but beneath it all was the intoxicating, rain-drenched pine aroma of the man standing far too close to her. Moving with a restless, predatory grace, Kael leaned over the table, his golden eyes scanning the movement of the black-armored wolves on the horizon. He didn't look at the generals. He looked at the way Asha's silver light flickered when she breathed, a visual heartbeat of her rising power. The rival Alpha is moving with a speed that suggests he's not just invading, he's hunting, Kael rumbled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of Asha's bones. Following the path of the enemy's advance, it became clear that the Black Ridge was being circled like a wounded stag. Why did Kael keep positioning himself as her shield when he knew she was now the most powerful weapon in the room? Because the ghost of his rejection still stood between them like a wall of ice. Every brush of his hand against hers felt like a high-stakes gamble. Asha pulled her map marker back, her eyes meeting his with a coldness that made his wolf whimper in the back of his throat. "Do not mistake my presence for forgiveness, Kael," she whispered, the silver light in her eyes flaring with a sudden, jagged intensity. "I am standing here because my blood demands I protect this land, not because I have forgotten the night you told me I was nothing." The high-stakes emotional war was proving to be far more exhausting than the physical one brewing at their gates. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between soldiers and lovers, and in that moment, the room seemed to shrink until there was only the two of them and the impending storm. Kael reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek, his expression a mask of raw, bleeding regret. "I would have traded my life for a different yesterday, Asha," he murmured, his voice cracking with the strain of a bond he had tried to kill. The subplot of their broken history was finally being dragged into the light, but before she could answer, the heavy oak doors burst open. The war was no longer a map, it was a scream echoing from the outer walls. Chapter 14. The Silver Torrent. As the transition into the first wave of the invasion shattered the fragile peace of the war room, the atmosphere of the castle turned into a furnace of adrenaline and fear. Asha ran toward the battlements, her bare feet barely touching the stones as the silver fire in her veins roared to life. Because the rival Alpha's wolves were fueled by dark magic, they didn't shift like normal Lycans. They were monsters of shadow and bone, leaping over the walls with a terrifying, unnatural speed. She reached the edge of the parapet and looked down at the sea of black fur and steel that threatened to swallow her home. Moving like a storm cloud made flesh, Asha raised her hands to the sky, the silver energy erupting from her palms in a blinding torrent of light. Following the ancient laws of the Silver Crest, she didn't just fight. She commanded the very air, turning the wind into a series of jagged blades that tore through the enemy's front lines. The pack watched in a mixture of awe and terror as their servant became a goddess of destruction, her hair whipping around her face like a halo of white fire. High-stakes combat turned the courtyard into a symphony of snarls and the metallic clash of teeth against bone. Because of the intensity of her power, the rival Alpha finally stepped into the fray, his black armor smoking as the silver light hit it. He looked up at Asha, a hideous, triumphant grin stretching across his face. "There she is," he roared, his voice a distorted howl that made the stones beneath her feet vibrate. "The sacrifice that will make me immortal." The subplot of his true intent was now a physical threat as he began to scale the wall with a speed that defied gravity. Asha felt her pulse hammer a frantic rhythm, her silver fire flickering as she realized she was being drained by the very land she was trying to save. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between triumph and disaster, and Asha felt the ground slip out from under her. Just as the rival Alpha reached the top of the battlement, a golden blur intercepted him with the force of a falling star. Kael had leaped from the higher tower, his massive wolf form slamming into the shadow beast and sending them both tumbling back into the chaos below. The high-stakes sacrifice of the prince was a visual shock that made Asha's heart stop. She didn't think. She leaped after them, her silver light forming a protective cocoon around the golden wolf who had finally chosen her over his own survival. Chapter 15. The Price of the Bond. The transition from the heights of the wall to the blood-soaked mud of the courtyard was a dizzying plunge into the heart of the nightmare. Asha landed on her feet, the impact sending a shockwave of silver energy through the ground that cleared a circle around the fallen prince. Kael was shifted back into his human form, his chest heaving and blood staining his golden skin. Because he had taken the brunt of the rival Alpha's dark magic, his wolf was silent. trapped beneath a layer of shadow that looked like a spreading poison. Asha dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for his cooling skin. Moving with a desperation that ignored the battle raging around them, Asha pressed her palms against Kael's chest, her silver light flowing into him in a frantic, uneven rhythm. "Don't you dare leave me now," she hissed, her tears hitting his face like warm rain. "You still owe me 1,000 apologies, Kael. You don't get to die until I say you can." Following the connection of the bond, she felt his heart stutter and then catch, her power acting as a bridge for his failing spirit. The high-stakes intimacy of the moment was a raw, bleeding confession that neither of them could take back. Because the rival Alpha was regrouping, the air began to thicken with a cloying, suffocating darkness. He stood at the edge of the circle, his eyes glowing with a hateful, frustrated light. "You waste your power on a dying dog," he spat, his hand forming a jagged blade of shadow. "Give me the crest, girl, and I might let the rest of your pack live as my slaves." Asha looked up, her face a mask of cold, diamond-hard resolve. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like the end of a long, dark story. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between a girl and a queen, and Asha felt the final barrier in her soul shatter. She stood up, her hands still linked with Kael's, her silver light turning into a pillar of fire that reached the clouds. The subplot of her rejection was over. The narrative of her reign was beginning. "You want the crest?" she asked, her voice sounding like the cracking of the earth itself. "Then come and take it from the woman who has nothing left to lose." The war was far from over, but as the silver fire consumed the shadows, the Black Ridge knew that the night finally belonged to them. Chapter 16. The Poisoned Crown. The transition from the blinding silver heat of the battlefield to the suffocating chill of the royal chambers felt like a sudden plunge into stagnant water. Asha's heart was still drumming a war beat against her ribs, her skin stained with the soot of the rival Alpha's shadows and the drying copper of Kael's blood. Because the enemy had been temporarily driven back into the mists, a fragile, hollow silence settled over the mountain, but it was a peace that felt more like a trap than a reprieve. She walked beside the healers carrying Kael's limp form, her fingers still tingling from the massive discharge of energy that had saved his life. Every guard she passed didn't just bow. They averted their eyes as if looking at her directly would burn their retinas. Moving with a jagged, nervous energy, the king stood at the head of the medical wing, his face a landscape of deep-set wrinkles and cold, calculating desperation. He didn't look at his son's broken body with the grief of a father. He looked at Kael as a failed tool, and at Asha as a rising threat. "The palace is secure for now," the king announced, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a lead pipe. Following the sharp flick of his hand, the guards closed the heavy oak doors, locking Asha inside the room with the man who had overseen her years of misery. Why did the air in the room suddenly smell of silver nitrate and nightshade, a scent that made her dead wolf snarl in warning? Because the truth of the Silver Crest massacre was a secret the king was willing to kill for, the high-stakes tension shifted from the external war to the internal rot of the throne. Asha stepped toward him, the silver light in her eyes flaring with a cold, rhythmic pulse that made the torches on the walls flicker and die. "The rival Alpha didn't just find me, did he?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous vibration that shattered a crystal vase on the side table. "You invited him here because you realized my power was waking up, and you'd rather see this mountain burn than see me sit on a throne you stole from my mother." The subplot of the king's betrayal was finally a physical weight in the room, a jagged blade held to the throat of the pack's future. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between suspicion and a death sentence, and Asha felt the trap snap shut around her ankles. The king didn't deny it. He simply smiled, a thin, colorless line that didn't reach his flinty eyes. "A throne is not a seat for a girl who cries over a prince," he spat, his hand moving to a lever hidden behind a tapestry. Before Asha could react, the floor beneath her feet vanished, replaced by a sliding chute of cold, reinforced steel. She fell into the dark, her silver light guttering out as a specialized dampening field, built from the very minerals that killed her ancestors, swallowed her whole. The betrayal was complete, and as the ceiling closed above her, she realized the king had never intended for her to survive the night. Chapter 17. The Pit of Ash. As the transition into the lightless void of the dampening chamber took hold, the atmosphere shifted from regal conflict to primal survival. Asha hit the bottom of the pit with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the air from her lungs and sending stars dancing across her vision. Because the walls were lined with obsidian quell, a rare volcanic glass that absorbed Lycan energy, she felt her silver fire being drained away like water in the desert. She was back to being a ghost, a nameless runt in the dark, stripped of the goddess form that had terrified the court. The silence of the pit was absolute, a heavy velvet weight that pressed against her eardrums until she could hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of her own failing heart. Moving like a wounded animal, she crawled toward the corner of the cell, her fingers scraping against the smooth, cold glass. She reached for her wolf, but the connection was a frayed wire sparking with a weak, agonizing heat that only reminded her of what she was losing. Following the memory of Kael's face in the courtyard, she tried to find a reason to keep fighting, but the dampening field was a high-stakes psychological torture that made every hope feel like a lie. "Kael," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo that didn't even reach the ceiling. Why did the man she had finally started to trust have to be the son of the monster who had buried her alive? Because the king's plan required her total erasure, a series of vents opened high above, hissing with the sound of a specialized gas designed to put a wolf into a permanent, dreamless sleep. The subplot of the rival Alpha's sacrifice was now a secondary concern. The king was going to use her dormant body as a battery to power the mountain's defenses, turning her into a living, breathing generator for his own reign. Asha felt her limbs grow heavy, her eyelids drooping as the sweet, cloying scent of the gas filled her nose. She was slipping away, the narrative of the silver crest ending not with a roar, but with a quiet, forgotten sigh in a hole in the ground. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between death and a second awakening, and Asha felt a sudden, violent jolt of electricity hit her spirit. It wasn't her power, it was the bond. Far above, in the medical wing, Kael had woken up, his wolf screaming through the link in a frantic, soul-tearing search for its mate. The high-stakes connection between them acted as a conductor, bypassing the dampening field because it wasn't made of magic but of raw biological destiny. Asha's eyes snapped open, the silver light returning to her pupils with a jagged, white-hot intensity that cracked the glass walls of her prison. She wasn't a battery. She was a supernova, and the king had underestimated the strength of a heart that had already survived the dirt once. Chapter 18. The Queen's Exodus. The transition from the depths of the pit to the surface of the mountain was a violent upward eruption of pure, unadulterated power. Asha didn't wait for a door. She used the silver fire coiling in her gut to shatter the ceiling, the explosion of glass and stone shaking the palace to its foundations. She rose from the ruins of the dungeon like a wraith of vengeance, her hair a silver flame, and her gown tattered into a battle cloak of shadow and light. Because the king's guards were human form in the narrow corridors, they couldn't stand against the kinetic force of her presence, falling back like dry leaves in a hurricane as she marched toward the throne room. Moving with a steady, terrifying purpose, Asha burst into the royal hall, the heavy doors turning to splinters before her. The king stood by the throne, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a final, jagged cowardice. He reached for his sword, but the silver light from Asha's fingertips pinned him against the stone wall before he could even draw the blade. "I am the daughter of the woman you murdered," she roared, her voice sounding like the crashing of 100 tectonic plates. Following the rhythm of her rage, the palace windows shattered inward, the glass forming a spinning halo around her as she stepped toward her tormentor. Because the rival Alpha's forces were breached the outer gates again, the high-stakes climax was a three-way war for the soul of the North. Kael stumbled into the room, leaning on a spear for support, his eyes locking onto Asha with a mixture of horror and absolute, heart-shattering love. He saw his father pinned to the wall and the woman he loved becoming a force of nature that threatened to consume everything. The subplot of his loyalty was finally pushed to the breaking point. "Asha, stop!" he cried out, his voice a ragged plea that cut through the sound of the storm. "If you kill him like this, you become the monster he wanted you to be." Transitional phrases bridge the gap between justice and mercy, and Asha felt the silver fire in her veins falter for a split second. She looked at the king, a pathetic, trembling old man who had traded his honor for a chair, and then she looked at Kael, the man who had crawled out of a coma to find her. The high-stakes choice was no longer about power, it was about the kind of queen she wanted to be. She released the king, letting him slump to the floor in a heap of velvet and shame. "I won't kill you," she said, her voice a cold, rhythmic pulse that filled the room. "I will simply leave you to the world you created." She turned her back on the throne, walking toward Kael and the war waiting outside, choosing a future made of scars over a past made of blood. Chapter 19. The Frost of Betrayal. The transition from the throne room's suffocating drama to the freezing reality of the castle battlements felt like a plunge into a frozen lake. Asha stood atop the ramparts, the silver energy in her veins cooling into a sharp, jagged edge that mirrored the ice forming on the stone. Because the king's cowardice had left the pack's leadership in a shambles, the warriors below moved with a sluggish, confused energy that smelled of impending defeat. She watched the black-armored wolves of the rival pack emerge from the tree line, their numbers seemingly tripled by the shadows of the approaching eclipse. The air tasted of ozone and ancient malice, a heavy, cloying scent that made her dead wolf snarl with a hunger for a different kind of justice. Moving with a steady, rhythmic pace that commanded the attention of every shivering guard, Asha walked the length of the wall. She didn't look like the servant they had ignored for years. She looked like the storm that had finally arrived to claim the mountain. Following the path of the enemy's siege engines, she realized the rival Alpha wasn't just planning a raid. He was intending to wipe the Black Ridge from the map entirely. Why did her heart still hammer against her ribs when she heard the heavy, uneven footsteps of Kael approaching from behind? The high-stakes pressure of the coming slaughter made every personal grudge feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. Because the bond between them was now a physical cord of heat in the frozen air, Kael's presence was a sensory assault she couldn't ignore. He stopped beside her, his hand gripping the cold stone until it cracked under his shifting strength. "My father is in the cells, and the council is screaming for a leader," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that sent a jolt of electricity through her spirit. The subplot of their fractured romance was being drowned out by the drums of war, yet the way he looked at her suggested he would let the whole world burn just to hear her say his name again. "They won't follow a prince who let his father fall, Asha. They will only follow the silver light." Transitional phrases bridged the gap between a broken past and a desperate future, and Asha felt the weight of the crown she hadn't yet put on. She looked at Kael, her eyes glowing with a cold lunar fire that made him flinch. "I am not leading them for a throne, Kael," she said, her voice a steady pulse that cut through the whistling wind. "I am leading them because the moon doesn't forget its own, and I won't let my people become sacrifices for a madman's ego." The high-stakes conflict of the night was finally reaching its zenith as the first black arrow whistled through the air, sparking the beginning of the end. Chapter 20. The Eclipse of Souls. As the transition into the total eclipse began, the atmosphere of the mountain turned into a surreal, monochrome nightmare. The sun was swallowed by the moon, casting a sickly violet light over the battlefield that made the silver fire in Asha's skin burn with a blinding intensity. Because the rival Alpha's power was tied to the shadows, the darkness acted as a catalyst for his monsters, their forms growing larger and more distorted as the light vanished. She stepped off the battlements, her descent slowed by a cushion of kinetic energy, landing in the center of the fray like a star falling into a pit. Every swing of her hand sent a wave of silver fire through the shadow wolves, turning them to ash before they could even draw breath. Moving like a vision of vengeance, Asha carved a path through the carnage, her silver light acting as a beacon for the Black Ridge warriors who had been losing hope. Following the golden blur of Kael's wolf form, she saw him tearing through the enemy's flank, his movements a symphony of lethal grace that complemented her raw, elemental power. The high-stakes battle was no longer a mess of claws and teeth. It was a coordinated dance of light and gold against the encroaching dark. Why did the rival Alpha remain at the edge of the woods, watching the slaughter with a calm, terrifying patience that suggested he was waiting for something specific? Because the eclipse was a high-stakes celestial event, the air suddenly grew thin, the pressure dropping until Asha's ears popped. The rival Alpha stepped forward, his black armor dissolving into a swarm of literal shadows that surged toward the center of the field. The subplot of his true origin was finally revealed. He wasn't a wolf at all, but a fragment of the ancient darkness that the silver crest had been created to contain. Asha felt her silver light flicker as the darkness touched her, a cold, oily sensation that tried to slide into her mind and rewrite her memories. She wasn't just fighting for a pack. She was fighting to keep the very concept of light alive. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between exhaustion and a final, desperate surge of will. Asha felt Kael's presence at her back, his heat a constant anchor in the rising tide of shadow. "Together," he growled, the word vibrating through their shared bond with the force of a sacred vow. The high-stakes intimacy of their connection became a conduit, Kael's physical strength feeding into Asha's spiritual fire until the silver light turned into a white-hot sun that defied the eclipse. They weren't just two wolves anymore. They were a single, unstoppable force of nature, and the darkness finally began to scream. Chapter 21. The Altar of the First. The transition from the chaotic battlefield to the ancient hidden altar at the mountain's peak was a blur of speed and silver fire. Asha and Kael pursued the rival Alpha as he fled toward the source of the Silver Crest's power, the very place where the first of her line had been blessed by the moon. Because the altar was a natural amplifier for lunar energy, the atmosphere there was so thick with power that it was difficult to breathe. The rival Alpha stood at the center of the stone circle, his form flickering like a dying candle as he tried to siphon the mountain's core. "You are too late, little queen," he hissed, his voice a chorus of 1,000 drowned souls. Moving with a finality that brooked no argument, Asha stepped into the circle, her silver fire expanding until it touched every stone in the ancient structure. Following the instinct of her blood, she realized that to kill the darkness, she couldn't just fight it. She had to absorb it and neutralize it within her own spirit. The high-stakes sacrifice was a silent choice she made in the space between heartbeats, a secret she didn't even share with Kael through their link. She reached out and grabbed the rival Alpha's throat, her silver light turning inward, pulling the shadows into herself like a vacuum. The agony was absolute, a cold fire that threatened to shatter her bones and erase her name. Because Kael sensed the shift in her energy, he lunged forward, his hand catching hers just as the darkness began to consume her. "I won't let you do this alone," he roared, his own soul opening to share the burden of the ancient rot. The subplot of his redemption was completed in that single, selfless act, his golden light mixing with her silver to create a barrier that the darkness couldn't breach. The high-stakes explosion of energy leveled the trees for miles, a shockwave of pure, purified light that washed over the mountains and signaled the end of the eclipse. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between the war and the silence that follows. When the light finally faded, the rival Alpha was gone, turned to dust by a power he couldn't comprehend. Asha and Kael lay on the cold stone, their hands still locked together, their breathing a ragged, synchronized rhythm. The mountain was silent, the war was over, and the rejected servant was finally standing on the threshold of a new world. She looked at Kael, her eyes no longer glowing, but filled with a soft, human warmth that was far more powerful than any silver fire. The crown was hers, but the victory belonged to the bond they had finally chosen for themselves. Chapter 22. The Ash of Empires. The transition from the blinding white-hot climax at the altar to the heavy gray dawn of the aftermath felt like a slow descent into a world made of glass. Asha stood at the jagged edge of the mountain peak, her tattered cloak fluttering in a wind that no longer smelled of sulfur or shadows, but of cold, cleansing snow. Because the rival Alpha's darkness had been eradicated, the atmospheric pressure that had stifled the valley for weeks finally broke, allowing the first true rays of the sun to pierce the morning mist. She looked down at her hands, where the glowing silver veins had receded, leaving behind faint, pearlescent scars that told the story of a war won at the cost of her innocence. The silence was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against her chest as she realized the mountain she had saved was now looking to her to lead it out of the rubble. Moving with the exhaustion that made every step feel like a trek through deep water, Kael approached her, his silhouette gold against the rising sun. He didn't speak, but the way his shadow fell across hers was a silent vow of presence, a high-stakes recognition that they were the only two people left who understood the true price of the night. Following the trail of smoke rising from the castle below, it was clear that the Black Ridge Pack was no longer a kingdom of warriors, but a collection of survivors searching for a reason to stay. Why did the sight of the ruined ramparts make her feel more like a prisoner than the dungeon ever had? The subplot of her personal freedom was now inextricably tangled with the duty of her blood, a golden cage she had built with her own hands. Because the bond had been the conduit for their victory, the telepathic static between them was now a clear, resonant frequency of shared grief and relief. Kael reached out, his fingers brushing the silver scars on her wrist with a tenderness that made her breath hitch in the frozen air. "The council is waiting at the gates, Asha," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor her to the earth. "They aren't waiting for a prince or a general. They are waiting for the woman who walked through the eclipse and came out holding the light." The high-stakes reality of her new position was a jagged pill to swallow, but as she looked into Kael's golden eyes, she saw a reflection of a queen who was no longer defined by the rejection of her past. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between the battlefield and the throne, and Asha felt the final remnants of the servant girl wither away in the morning light. She turned away from the precipice, her hand sliding into Kael's with a firm, decisive grip that signaled the end of their hesitation. "Then let them wait no longer," she said, her voice a steady pulse of authority that echoed off the ancient stones of the altar. They began the long descent toward the castle, a journey that was no longer an escape, but a homecoming to a throne that had been waiting 5 centuries for the return of the Silver Crest. Chapter 23. The Judgment of Stone. As the transition into the Great Hall began, the atmosphere shifted from the raw, elemental power of the mountain to the sharp political chill of a court in transition. Asha walked through the massive oak doors, her bare feet silent on the cold marble that was still stained with the shadows of the previous night's slaughter. Because the king had been found guilty of high treason by his own generals, he sat not on the throne, but in a heavy iron chair at the center of the room, his hands bound in the same dampening metal he had used on Asha. Every eye in the pack was a spear of judgment, but the weight of the room's expectations was directed solely at the woman who walked toward the dais with the grace of a predator and the stillness of a saint. Moving with a purpose that ignored the murmurs of the crowd, Asha stopped inches from the man who had tried to erase her existence. She didn't look at him with the rage she had carried in the dungeon. She looked at him with a terrifying, absolute indifference that was far more damaging than any snarl. Following the ancient protocol of the first wolves, she raised her hand, the silver light flickering briefly around her fingertips as she summoned the ancestral records from the archives. "You killed a lineage to save a chair," she said, her voice a low, rhythmic chime that filled every corner of the hall. "And in doing so, you became the very darkness you claimed to protect us from." The high-stakes verdict was a silent scream in the room as the council waited for her to demand his head. Because she was building a world based on justice rather than vengeance, Asha turned her back on the king and looked at the assembled pack. The subplot of the pack's internal corruption was finally being addressed, not with a blade, but with a new set of laws that recognized worth beyond muscle and birthright. "The Black Ridge will not be built on the blood of its own," she proclaimed, her voice rising until it shook the rafters. "The former king will spend the rest of his days in the silent cells of the western peaks, a ghost in a kingdom that no longer knows his name." The shock of her mercy was a high-stakes gamble on the pack's soul, a move that either made her a visionary or a target for the next ambitious warrior. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between the old law and the new, and Asha felt the shift in the pack's energy like a change in the weather. Kael stepped forward, kneeling at the base of the dais, his head bowed in a gesture of submission that was no longer a ritual but a choice. One by one, the generals followed, the sound of their armor hitting the stone, a series of metallic claps that signaled the end of the rebellion. Asha stood before the empty throne, the weight of the mountain's future settling onto her shoulders with a finality that made her spirit ache. She didn't sit. She simply stood as the sun hit the silver crest carved into the back of the chair, a symbol of a promise finally kept. Chapter 24: The Silver Horizon. The transition from the Day of Judgment to the first month of her reign was a blur of rebuilding, diplomacy, and the slow, agonizing process of healing a fractured people. Asha stood on the balcony of the royal apartments, watching the pack members work together to repair the outer walls, their voices carrying on the wind in a way that sounded less like a dirge and more like a song. Because she had abolished the caste system that had kept people like her in the dirt, the energy of the mountain had shifted from fear to a cautious, burgeoning hope. She felt the heavy, comforting presence of Kael behind her, his scent of pine and lightning a constant reminder of the bond that had survived the fire. Moving with a tenderness that was reserved only for her, Kael wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He didn't talk about the throne or the borders. He simply rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath a warm, rhythmic pulse against her neck. "The northern packs have sent envoys," he whispered, his voice a low rumble of contentment. "They want to sign the treaty, Asha. They want to be part of the world the Silver Crest is building." Following the path of the eagles soaring over the peaks, it was clear that the war had done what 5 centuries of politics couldn't. It had united the wolves under a single, luminous banner. Why did the peace feel more fragile and precious than the victory itself? Because the final subplot of her life, her own happiness, was finally allowed to breathe? Asha turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She looked into his golden eyes and saw the man who had been her enemy, her protector, and finally, her equal. "We aren't just building a kingdom, Kael," she said, her voice a soft, melodic promise. "We are building a home for every runt, every defect, and every soul that was told it didn't belong." The high-stakes intimacy of their shared future was the ultimate prize, a reward that went beyond crowns and lineage. She pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of the future, a blend of sweetness and strength that signaled the end of the long night. Transitional phrases bridged the gap between the story told and the life lived, and as the silver horizon glowed with the light of a new day, Asha realized the journey was only beginning. The rejected servant was gone, replaced by a queen who knew that true power didn't come from the blood in her veins, but from the love in her heart. She looked out at her pack, her mountain, and her mate, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a weight. It was a symphony. The silver crest had returned, and the moon, at long last, was satisfied.